In this video, I'm going to tell you about some of the better uses out there for Games Workshop's contrast paints. Games Workshop came out with contrast paints back in June of 2019. And the idea behind them was one thick coat. For years and years and years, you've always heard that with opaque paints, you want to put on two thin coats or more, depending on how you're painting. And that's kind of difficult for some folks. Some folks have a hard time with that. Some folks don't like the extra time that they perceive it to take. And so part of the concept behind contrast paints was that you prime these models a light color, white or a very light gray or very light tan, and then you put these colors directly over the top of it, one thick coat. And the idea is that it's supposed to seep down into the crevices, kind of like a wash does, but a little bit more. But it's also supposed to sort of stain the middle ground more than a wash will. And then also any kind of pokey-uppy bits, it's supposed to kind of actually, as it dries, pull away from those parts to make them look a little bit lighter, almost highlighted because of the light primer underneath. I did a video about contrast paints after using them for a year, and what I thought about them. Pachow, so maybe check that out. As I've been using these contrast paints more and more, I've been finding that I'm not using them in the way I just explained. I tried it once. I took a model, Space Marine, and I sprayed him, I think, the gray sear color, primer that they had, and started working with some of the colors to try to paint the Space Marine. And it just didn't look good. Now, admittedly, I would say that Space Marines are not the ideal model to paint with contrast paints. Contrast paints work best on scaly lizard type models, furry, fur-covered creatures, that kind of stuff. Lots and lots of detail, rock creatures, all kinds of stuff like that. That kind of texture is really what makes the paint do its job. Smooth, flat armor, shoulder pads, all that kind of stuff doesn't really give the material someplace to flow very easily, and it can get a little splotchy in certain spots depending on how quickly you paint it on. It's just a difficult thing to paint Space Marines. I wouldn't paint a vehicle with contrast paints for the most part, but for other types of more organic creatures, it's spectacular. That being said, I'm using it in a lot of situations that aren't kind of the way that Games Workshop originally kind of nailed down and said, this is the way. As I've been painting on Twitch twice a week, and if you're not following me, you should check out twitch.tv/tabletopminions. And I'm usually on Monday nights Central Time and Friday morning Central Time. But the questions I've been getting as I've been using contrast paint in many of the projects that I've been working on Twitch is, well, why are you using it this way? Why aren't you using it the way they explained it? How come you're doing this? And so I thought I'd try to answer some of those questions here and explain some different ways that maybe you're not using contrast that you might actually get a lot more use out of. I think that the best way to use contrast paints is over something called a zenithal highlight. Now, you've possibly heard that term thrown around a good deal. The long and short of it is you take a model and you prime it with a very dark color, maybe black, maybe dark brown, maybe dark green, kind of depends on the model, and you let that sit for maybe 5-10 minutes, and then you spray it from above with a light color. So when you start with that dark color, you want to get it in all the nooks and crannies, get it underneath, get everywhere. But when you spray that light color, you're only kind of spraying it from above. And what it does is it mimics the light from the sky coming down and hitting that model. And the benefit to this is that if you're just going to be using completely opaque paints, you can at least look at it and see where the light hits on the top of the nose, on the edge of the eyebrows, and on the body, and that kind of stuff. So that as you go in and start to highlighting, you've got a little example, which you then cover with opaque paint. I'm kind of lazy and don't want to do it that way. So what I do is I do the zenithal highlight, and then I use transparent paints over it so that the black and white shading is basically accentuated by the color. It's kind of like taking a black and white photo and then taking a clear piece of, let's say, red plastic and putting it over there. And then now you've got, instead of black and white, you've got black and red. And you're just doing that in all kinds of different areas all over the model in different contrast or whatever types of glazes and colors and things like that. But they need to be transparent for this trick to work. The thing is it makes you look like you know how to blend way better than you actually do. And I talk about that all the time on Twitch. It is a literal just, I'm going to spray everything kind of white from the top, but make sure that I don't get it in the armpits and below the chin and all those different places. And then when I put that transparent shade over the top of it, it makes it look like I went through and used like a light green up here and then faded it, with wet blending down to the dark green in the eye sockets and all that kind of stuff. And literally all I did was went and just kind of slopped some color over it from like a contrast color, and then it dried. And that's literally it. That's one of the biggest benefits of contrast colors, putting it over the light color that they want you to put over. If you like that look, that's great. But if you want things to be a little bit more contrasty, even though it's contrast paint, kind of confusing there. But I'm talking about actually have a little bit more pop to the model, shadows actually, as opposed to just like light areas and slightly darker areas. Zenithal highlighting is really the way to go. It speeds things up, makes you look like you know what you're doing. And you don't have to use completely with sprays either. You can also just spray it completely black or paint it black with a brush if that's how you like to do your priming. And then when you want to do that second coat, that Zenithal highlight, take yourself a big fat makeup brush from the dollar store. I've talked about makeup brushes and their awesomeness before. A chow. And like I did with these Necrons, you can just dry brush, in this case silver, over the top to get yourself the effect. And then when you start covering everything with, the whatever color you're going to use, it works out really, really well. Many of the miniatures that we paint on any given day have guns. Obviously, some have swords and some have claws and whatever. But if you're playing anything basically kind of modern and forward into the future, probably guns are being, held by your models. And most guns, not all, but most guns have a tendency to be black. That's just the kind of the way it works. So I love to use the Black Templar contrast paint from Games Workshop to paint guns. Now, you may say to yourself, well, but why can't I just paint the guns with normal opaque black paint? And you can, certainly. I've been doing it for years. But there's two things. Number one, Black Templar as a color, as a contrast color, is not completely opaque. So if you did do that previous step I mentioned with the Zenithal highlighting, and you've got now a light color on the top of your gun and darker color on the sides and on the underside, when you put that Black Templar over the top of it, it's going to be a slightly lighter dark, a slightly lighter black across the top than it is on the sides and the bottom, which will give a little bit more depth and three-dimensionality to your model. The other thing is that that paint, contrast paint in general, is very fluid. So you can, if you have a bigger brush, and I'm talking not like a 00, but maybe something like a 2 or a 3, and it's got a nice belly to it. You got to have a nice belly. And you dunk that into that Black Templar, you can usually paint the entire gun in one go without having to constantly go back to the paint pot and get more paint like you do with most opaque paints. Opaque paints, because they're so much thicker and less fluid generally, they take a lot more dipping to get what you need done on the model. And when you're using the Black Templar stuff, you can easily just kind of put it on there, put it on thick, and then just move it to the other places and kind of spread it all around, and you get a really nice looking gun. And then like with these AK-47s here from the Cultists, it's very easy to do like the wood parts as well with, I think this was snakebite leather over like a light umber color. So that was a very quick process as well. And it just looks good. You go back, maybe throw a little bit of dry brush of silver on there just to kind of give that idea. In the real world, no one's gun ever looks like that. But you put that extra little dry brush of silver in there at the end, and it really makes it look like it's something that's got a little bit of wear and tear to it, and it makes it look more like a gun. So take a look at that. It works really, really well for those types of things. It also works very well on certain types of terrain, like with these Warcry kind of wooden palisade things. All that bottom part of the wood, I started all that with wildwood from contrast paints. And on the slats here too, that's all, again, just wildwood directly over whatever colors I already had down there. Again, it's one of those almost completely but not completely opaque colors. And once it dries, you just kind of take against the grain a dry brush of like some light tan or something like that. It makes it look like wood. Sometimes metallics can be a little boring. Sometimes it's just a lot of the same silver and gold and maybe a brass or a copper or something like that. With contrast paints, you can do a lot of interesting things to get colors that you wouldn't normally get. Before I mentioned my Necrons, when I was talking about Zenithal highlighting, that whole process of basically just, priming them black and then dry brushing them silver. Later on, I did some other ones where I actually just airbrushed the silver on there too. That's also completely fine. And then covering everything in just the right kind of color, just the right kind of contrast color, gives that variation between the silver and black. So instead of a black and white photo, you have a black and silver photo of your model. And now instead of laying, just some other opaque paints over it and changing things, you're just throwing a filter, just a color over it that's transparent. Now you can still see the fade from silver to black. It just makes the model look a lot better right off the bat. And then when you want to go through and add a little bit more corrosion and kind of variation, you can do the stippling. I talked about stippling before as well on the channel, and it works really, really well for getting your models to be like just about like very easily textured, but not physically bumpy textured, more visually textured, color texture. That's the important thing. So doing that in metallics in the past has been very, very difficult, but using something like this, because it's thicker than a normal wash, and it's even thicker a bit than a glaze, but still has a great amount of transparency and control. I really like it for working with metallics, especially if I want something that's not the standard kind of, silver or gold or whatever. I want a weird looking metallic color, contrast paints. And lastly, this one's probably not for everyone because it kind of requires that you have an airbrush. When you shoot contrast paint through an airbrush, it acts completely different. It does not pool into the crevices. It does not pull away from the sharp highlights or the sharp peaks and things like that and whatever. What it does is it becomes just like regular airbrush paint. The difference is that regular opaque airbrush paint covers what you spray it onto, okay? If you have a thing that is blue and you decide you want to shadow it along the bottom and you take some black paint, it will, in most situations, where those speckles of paint, those little tiny super fine speckles hit, they will turn black and they won't be transparent. When you spray contrast paint through an airbrush, it hits and it's transparent. So it's much easier to control and to fade. If you're trying to use a piece of terrain like this dumpster and this container thing, they sit outside, it rains, the mud gets wet, it splashes up and hits the side. These kind of things sit around outside for a long time. They get sun bleached from above and they're darker towards the bottom. Being able to do that very, very fine kind of gradient along the bottom is very, very easy. Firing generally colors like Agoros Dunes, maybe Skeleton Horde again, stuff like that through your airbrush. Works spectacularly well. It also works well for just kind of shading things in terrain. These bastions here, you can see the bastion that's been shaded was shaded with contrast paints, and the other one that hasn't been really finished yet, that one looks a lot flatter and more dull, putting in this extra kind of like contrast sort of like shadow thing around there for shading on the bottoms of things, or just to make panels not all be one color. It's really quick and easy. And if you've got an airbrush, think about firing some contrast through it. Just understand it's not gonna act like the way that you expect when you put it on with a brush. So if you've seen other people's results with contrast paints and you've been unimpressed because they've been following the instructions, either see them online or you see them from your friends and things like that, still think about giving contrast colors a chance. I've been using them, like I said, in just about everything I paint, but when you use them with the zenithal kind of style, or you use them for painting guns or terrain or over metallics or firing it through your airbrush, they have a lot of benefit. You kind of have to know how to use them to get the best benefit out of them. They still work great the way that they were intended by Games Workshop, if that's the kind of look you want. But if you want your stuff to not necessarily look like it was contrast painted, but you still want the benefits of contrast paint, following these instructions can help you get to finished models faster and make them look better and make you get to gaming a little bit quicker.